Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Washington Times for this special episode of History as It Happens, a podcast for people who want to think about current events historically. I'm Martin DeCaro, and our guest today, Catholic University historian Michael Kimmage. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you here. You were a member of the State Department's policy planning staff 2014 to 2016. Your portfolio was Russia and Ukraine, so you bring a lot of expertise to the subject we're going to talk about today. You are an expert on U.S. Russia relations, and that is the road to war in Eastern Europe. How did we get to this point where Europe is seeing its first major land war since World War II, with the possible exception of the breakup of Yugoslavia, a civil war? So let's begin with something I usually stay away from, my day-to-day podcast, and that is what's happening on the ground. We want the podcast to survive forever and not become dated, but I am curious as to what you think about why Russia's invasion has gone so poorly, at least from a Russian perspective, not achieving any major objectives yet.
Well, I think there are a couple of factors. It begins, I think, with an ambition that was unrealizable from the beginning. And this ambition was to dominate entirely the country of Ukraine, to knock out its government, to put in a puppet, really to take control in some way, maybe not over all of Ukrainian territory, but over most of it. Now, it's a country that's roughly the size of Texas, a population a bit less than 40 million people, and the Russians came in with an army of 200,000 soldiers. So it just wasn't proportional from the beginning, and there was great overconfidence on the Russian side about the Ukrainians falling apart or joining up with the Russians, and that's, I think, the primary reason.
The hubris. We hear from our Western perspective the idea that Ukrainians wanted to revolt from these imaginary Nazis that had taken over the country in Putin's view. Obviously, as you just said, the Ukrainians not rallied to the Russian flag, but also logistically, lack of air supremacy, just from a tactical, strategic standpoint, this professional army, I think, has surprised a lot of people with how poorly it has performed.
Well, of course, there are two ways of looking at the same issue here. On the one hand, Ukrainians have performed way above expectations that many in the U.S., in Ukraine and Russia had for the Ukrainian military. So part of it is the success of the Ukrainian military. They have high morale. They've really been training and improving their military since 2014, and they have the assistance of quite a few very powerful countries, including the United States. So that's clearly a major factor. But beyond an unrealizable concept that either Putin or his generals developed for this war, you see lots of corruption within the Russian military. You just see a sense of confusion, I think, on the part of Russian soldiers as to what it is that they're fighting for. So that's a recipe for not succeeding.
Echoes of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, when recruits were drawn to the theater of war with no clue where they were going or why they were there.
True.
Of course, we're speaking here in late springtime, heading into the summer, so that can change. As we know, Russia is still a very powerful military, could potentially blast its way to something called victory. That's what Sir Max Hastings, the great military historian, thought could happen when he joined me on the podcast a few weeks ago. But in the meantime, enormous amount of destruction and suffering and a massive refugee problem that could destabilize that part of Europe.
That's for sure. I mean, you have millions upon millions of internally displaced people within Ukraine, people who have moved from the east to the west or from battle zones to parts that aren't under immediate fire. And then, of course, you have, I believe it's around 5 million refugees in Poland and elsewhere. So the scale of this, in humanitarian terms, cannot be exaggerated. It's an utter catastrophe for the people of Ukraine.
I think Poland's population jumped 10-something% in a short period of time. It's just because of refugees. Amazing. Okay, so let's talk a little history, shall we? Do you remember what you were doing besides opening presents on Christmas Day, 1991?
Christmas Day 1991, I don't really remember, but I do recall, sort of as a historian, that the flag was coming down, the Soviet flag was coming down, and something new was being born. It wasn't just the Russian Federation, but 15 new countries, a new map of Europe. And I do recall also, having been about 18 years old at the time, the great feeling of optimism. Yes. Maybe not all Russians felt it, but certainly in the U.S. we felt it, and across much of Europe there was a sense of a new beginning.
Now, you're reading my mind. I was going to ask you about that moment of optimism. I'm talking about the day, Christmas Day, 1991. President Bush gave a televised address. Now, I was 16 years old. I was not paying attention to international politics or what really was going on in the news. I do remember Reagan. I was a child of the 80s. I watched all those Cold War movies, Rambo and Red Dawn, which is still a very good movie, by the way. When was the last time you watched Red Dawn?
It's not since its childhood or early adolescence, yeah.
Darn good
Let's
movie.
not forget Firefox also.
Okay. President Bush on TV basically says, and I encourage everyone listening to seek this speech out. It's on YouTube. We won, they lost. Freedom and liberty prevailed. He said this is a victory for our values. It wasn't just that the Soviet Union collapsed from within. This was a victory for Western values. In a sense, we defeated them. But we know that Bush was also a pragmatist. He understood, because he was aware of European history, he was a pilot in World War II, that whatever the triumphalist feeling of that speech or those remarks on TV, he was aware of the potential dangers and challenges to come. I bring all of this up because as you reflect as a scholar on the past 30 years and that moment of optimism, which of your assumptions about the way history would develop after the Cold War have turned out not to be the way you expected?
I don't know what assumptions I had really at that time, apart from that general mood of optimism, that the walls were coming down, the Berlin Wall and others, the borders were opening up. There was a sense that a lot could be achieved through cooperation. And I think if you look back over the last 30 years, that's not wrong. A lot was achieved through cooperation. We collectively built a new Europe, where East and West were much more integrated, much more trade, commerce, exchange of ideas. It's not as if all of the optimism was misplaced. A lot of it really was better than it was during the Cold War. I think that the remaining question, or the outstanding question in 1991, and it's only grown in stature over time, is where does Russia fit in all of this? And I think that the assumption then, and this is much more questionable in retrospect, was that Russia would join the club in some form or fashion. It would be a partner, it would take on a market economy, it would become a democracy. Maybe Russians wouldn't become exactly like us, but they would speak the same language. And it's not as if that didn't happen at all. Lots of ways in which we can discuss those trends. But that's clearly not Putin's Russia, and we are back in a kind of confrontation that's in a way more acute than anything we experienced during the Cold War.
I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the state of U.S. Russia relations is at its worst point probably since the early Cold War days, the Cuban Missile Crisis, maybe Ronald Reagan's first term before the détente, when that was a very cold period of the Cold War. Well, you said two things there. I mean, we should focus on some of the successes, right? In Eastern Europe, the former bloc, those countries, despite some backsliding in Hungary and Poland, they are still democracies. They're working towards becoming integrated market economies. Would you agree?
Very much so. I think that for these countries, the progress that we might have hoped for after 1991 is very real. It was really achieved. And it wasn't just market economies and democracy. It was their national independence.
Yes.
And that's a story for peoples across Eastern and Central Europe. And that's a story that will take us to Ukraine. But of course, Ukraine is you can't put it in the category of prosperous, successful countries at the moment, because it's a somewhat different story. But that's where they wish to go.
That's right. Ukraine has always held a special place in this equation. Oh, another part of that optimism was that maybe the era of bloc politics, bloc strategy would come to an end. We have another dividing line in Europe again. Ukraine happens to be on the wrong side of it, although, I mean, for all intents and purposes, they're getting Article 5 protection in a way. We can get back to the present moment in a little bit. But, I mean, was that an unrealistic expectation that the era of bloc politics would go away?
Well, I would urge as much precision as possible. So there was a hope for a new world, for this broad cooperation that Russia, China, the United States would all be integrated into some kind of collective system. Goes back to Woodrow Wilson and dreams of world cooperation and world order. That was very much there, but it's not as if NATO was dismantled after 1991. And in fact, NATO was expanded across much of Europe, in part, and it varies from country to country, but in part as a hedge against Russia's return. So at the same time that there was a hope for a world without blocs and without conflict and without tension, that hope was qualified to a degree by the expectation that this might return, and that was one of the reasons why NATO is still kept in existence.
Did the Cold War really end? Some people say not really. What's your view on that? I mean, it did end. It did end, but there were continuities into the new era.
I think the Cold War ended certainly for a time. And one of the ways in which it's still over is that the Cold War was not just a battle of countries and not just a battle of armies and a matter of nuclear weapons. The Cold War was a battle of ideas. And whatever the current crisis is or the current competition is, it's much more of a standard kind of classic geopolitical competition between the United States and Russia, or between the West and Russia. It's not, I think, at the moment so much of a battle of ideas. So in that sense, the Cold War was different, and perhaps when it concluded in 1991, it concluded for good in its terms.
Some historians have argued that what we're witnessing right now are the wars of Soviet succession, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was not an event, it was a process still playing out to this day, obviously, because when empires collapse, it's a bloody, protracted process. The war in Chechnya in the early 90s, renewed again as Yeltsin was leaving the stage and Putin was coming on. Georgia in 2008 when George W. Bush was president, and now, of course, Ukraine. I shouldn't say now Ukraine. Ukraine since 2014. You were in the State Department when Crimea. Oh, no, you came in a little bit after the annexation of Crimea. I cannot blame that on you, unfortunately. Right. But to my point, what's your view as a historian on that idea that we're witnessing the wars of Soviet succession?
I think it's an excellent way of thinking of the current crisis and the current tensions. One of the things that the Cold War did, interestingly, was to keep things in check. At the same time that there was a lot of tension and conflict during the Cold War, in a way Europe got frozen. Maybe that's one of the ways in which it was cold. When the Soviet Union collapses, Europe unfreezes. And we might think of that as a good thing in terms of countries getting their independence and sort of national movements of rediscovery, Baltic republics, Poland, many other countries. That was, on balance, a very, very good thing. But by becoming unfrozen, you have a very open question of what the borders are, what the security structures are. NATO is one answer to that. It's been coherent for the NATO member states, but you have a lot of countries that are not in NATO. And you have Belarus to the north of Ukraine, and you have also Moldova to the south, where there's a Russian military presence in part of the country. And Belarus has sort of been absorbed recently into Russia, at least militarily. And Ukraine is a war zone. So gradually, sort of year by year, exactly as you suggest, there was a war in Georgia in 2008. It hasn't been a peaceful process. And in fact, it's been getting more bloody and more violent year by year. This process of figuring out where does Russia end and where does Europe begin, if those are the right terms. There's been a lot of debate, to say the least, about the NATO issue. To what extent can we blame NATO expansion for Russian aggression? John Mearsheimer, the scholar, basically says the United States is responsible for the war in Ukraine by pushing NATO expansion. We can get to him in a little bit. But to your point about those wars, they convinced countries in Eastern Europe that they needed to be in NATO, especially the wars in Chechnya in the 1990s. Absolutely.
1990s, okay, do you agree with that?
It's a very important point, that the way in which Russia, Boris Yeltsin's Russia in the 1990s, of course, before Putin comes to power, the way in which it managed some of its internal problems, especially the whole issue of Chechnya, which is politically a part of Russia, but it threatened to be a separatist territory, and it was suppressed very brutally. I think that a lot of countries in Central and Eastern Europe looked at that and said, well, this makes the whole issue of joining NATO all the more important. So yes, Boris Yeltsin's Russia did quite a bit to advance the urgency of expanding the NATO alliance.
So much focus on Putin. The 1990s are a very important decade in this story on the road to war. But when it comes to the NATO question and whether NATO should pack up its bags and go home because the Warsaw Pact had dissolved, or should expand slowly and selectively, or basically put the pedal to the metal, as what happened in 2008 with George Bush in the Bucharest conference and what followed after that. All those questions, they weren't decided in 1989, we're talking before the collapse of the Soviet Union now. But that was a key moment in this, the so-called not 1 inch promise. Mm-hmm. That is playing a part in today's drama, because Putin does say the West promised they would not expand NATO 1 inch past its current border. Well, that was just a discussion. That was a conversation between James Baker and Soviet officials. I think actually it was Gorbachev himself. We know that President George H.W. Bush and his cabinet ultimately decided that not only would a unified Germany remain part of NATO, but that NATO would have the freedom to potentially expand in the future. What are your thoughts on that chapter? Because, as I said, it's looming large right now, the so-called not 1 inch.
That's for sure. Well, the open door policy of NATO, which goes directly against the notion of not expanding at 1 inch, is in fact built into the NATO Charter of 1949. So structurally, NATO has had this element of it. Sweden and Finland are probably going to enter the alliance this summer on the basis of this policy, the open door policy, and that's not a 1989 shift. That's an old policy that's been woven into NATO. I think that it's perfectly legitimate to talk about the historical record and to go over those discussions and see what was said and what people felt and what they thought about it. That's a legitimate historical conversation. The idea that anything that James Baker would have said in private is binding or is sort of obligating the U.S. or Germany to do anything, I think is just off the mark. That's Russian storytelling and a part of their narrative, and in the end is really just a propaganda narrative on the Russian part. I don't think it plays any meaningful role in policy, and not to engage in a kind of schoolyard response to your question, but who is it for the Russians at the moment to ask about promises that have been broken and sort of treaties and such that have been violated? We could go down a long list of Russian violations over the last 20, 25 years, but especially under Putin. So it's a good historical conversation to have. You want to have good, accurate data. I see no policy consequence of what was discussed in 1989 that would change the nature of the open door, sort of discussion or the open door policy of NATO.
Well, in the final settlement, the treaty, I guess, which was the treaty that kind of ended the occupation of Germany after World War II, allowed for NATO expansion with some conditions. Now, of course, it didn't take long for that treaty to be interpreted differently depending on which side of the new dividing line you were on. But, I mean, it's my interpretation as just a reader of these issues. And Mary Elise Serrati has written a great book about it. I actually have that book here. I'm going to reference it at some point. That the Russians are getting the story wrong. And that doesn't mean that there weren't issues with NATO expansion or that NATO expansion was not a threat to Russia from their perspective. But this idea that it should never have expanded is not
It's
correct.
a red herring. It's not. It's not worth too much.
Do you remember the
serious
last
consideration?
Yeah. Do you remember the last country to be accepted into NATO?
In the last couple of years?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's North Macedonia
Yes.
or...
I do this sometimes to my guests. I like to put them on the spot, which is not fair because, you're not a walking encyclopedia. North Macedonia in 2020, Montenegro, tiny country in 2017, Albania and Croatia, former members of Yugoslavia, 2009. At one point in this debate, really going back to the early post-Cold War years, early 1990s, the notion that these tiny countries should be part of NATO was a non-starter, wasn't it? I mean, too much territory to defend. What's the interest of giving Article 5 protection to countries like this when it might be difficult to actually protect them in case of war?
I think the thinking behind NATO expansion, or some people prefer to use the term NATO enlargement, although I'm not quite sure what the difference is between those two words. But I think one of the premises was that it could help consolidate countries as democracies. So by bringing them into NATO, there is in the NATO Charter also a commitment to democracy. So there's a democratization agenda that's connected to the enlargement of NATO. But there's also the sense that, and this has been imperfect, but the sense that NATO helps to resolve regional security problems. So instead of having, let's say, a Germany that would be in NATO and a set of 3 Baltic republics that are not a part of NATO, if you put them all in NATO, it sort of unifies, it connects them, and it makes it very unlikely that there would be any sort of tension or conflict. Going back to the late 40s, this was really a question of Germany and France. That one of the great things that NATO did is to bring Germany and France into the same alliance, and of course the UK, and these countries that for so many years had gone to war with each other and seen each other as aggressors and enemies were suddenly partners and allies in an alliance, and that's done a lot of great things for Europe. And so I think there's a sense with some of these smaller countries that you can get a similar dynamic.
And the Baltic states wanted to join NATO.
Absolutely.
They had been living under Soviet domination. They were annexed by Stalin during World War II.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in their view, they weren't necessarily thinking about Germany, a revanchist Germany. Margaret Thatcher was in the late 1980s. She was concerned about a unified Germany because of World War II, but they were concerned about an aggressive Soviet Union.
100%.
But Ukraine falls into a different category. Maybe I'll get to Ukraine and NATO now. I want to talk to you about what condition U.S. Russia relations were in as the Yeltsin and Clinton administrations got underway, because they were in pretty good shape. There was still some leftover trust and communication and some hope for cooperation in the 1990s. So, well, it's up to you. Do we want to talk about Ukraine and NATO early 90s or U.S. Russia relations early 90s?
Well, why don't we start with U.S. Russia?
This is how my interviews go.
Build it up to
Okay.
Ukraine. I mean, I think the 1990s is the high point of the U.S.-Russian relationship. You have the highest number of meetings between Russian and American presidents.
Clinton went to Moscow a bunch of times.
Yeah, there was a lot of respect shown on both sides. I think even friendship you could see between the Bill and Boris, as they were referred to in the 1990s. You wouldn't want to romanticize it. You know, in terms of NATO, Yeltsin was not pleased to see NATO growing larger within Europe. That was an issue already then. There were lots of disagreements about former Yugoslavia and how to manage that of that crisis. And there was, I think, already then a kind of implicit tension that the U.S. was economically more powerful and militarily more powerful than the Russian Federation. And at the same time, you know, Yeltsin knew that, but he didn't want to be treated as the junior partner. So you get this tension there that's not fully resolved, but it's not a catastrophic tension in the 1990s by no means.
No, the two leaders got along really well. Yeltsin even called Clinton directly once for help in securing a loan from, I guess, the World Bank. Desperate need of it because it had been rejected, and he was able to get Clinton to get that loan through. But as far as, you know, Russia's place in the world, you alluded to this earlier in our conversation here. Clinton himself said about the importance of needing Russia. He said, without a stable, functioning Russia, I think he said something like the rest of the world will know sorrow. And we look at what's happening today. Russia is becoming a pariah in the eyes of the West. The view from the global South is a little bit different. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it still obtains, though. We do need Russia as part of the international community. Now, of course, that is incumbent upon Russia to not invade other countries, right? But going back to the 1990s, Clinton certainly understood this, but Russia was in such bad shape. The transition to a market economy and a democracy, if you will, it never really happened. And that affected the relationship.
The country was certainly struggling in the 1990s. You have a major economic crisis in the later part of the 1990s that really unwinds a lot of the sense of excitement and enthusiasm about the new world. There is in Russia to this day still a bit of resentment about the kind of advice that the U.S. gave about
shock therapy,
about economics. But you know, I think what one has to also factor in, not that you want to read back too much from the present moment, but when you see Putin, when you see his war in Ukraine, when you see Putin's popularity, such as it is at the present moment, what you also have to factor in is that Russia sees itself as having a privileged position in Eastern and Central Europe, and that's never easy to define. It's the countries on Russia's periphery, they use the term near abroad, where they feel like it's either their sphere of influence, or you could even think in quasi-imperial terms about that. I don't think that is forgotten in the 1990s. I don't think it's irrelevant to Boris Yeltsin's career. It's just that they didn't have the capacity to act on those aspirations, but they were there.
Well, they felt humiliated as a fallen empire.
Well, that's certainly an important part of it. And then there's a sense of this part of Europe as a buffer zone between Russia and the outside world. And there's just a habit of imperial thinking.
There's deep historical roots there.
Deep historical roots going back hundreds of years. And that's destined. I wouldn't want to overemphasize the sense of destiny in all of this, but that's destined to conflict with the American view of Europe, which is that the small states, the big states are autonomous. They have the freedom to choose. They're not supposed to be under anybody's domination. If they want to be
whole and free.
Yes, Europe whole and free. And if they want to be a part of American-led institutions like NATO, so be it. It's their choice. It's not something that Russia is able to veto. And Russia, I would really say, not just Putin, takes a very different view of it. So that's already there in the 1990s, but it's under the surface.
That is an intractable aspect of this conflict. These two worldviews that will never be squared with one another. And you're right, all Russian leaders, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, before Putin, felt, and Russian military officials, Russian intellectuals, Russian government figures, that moment when they had some political parties, you know, Russians of all stripes, felt a sense of humiliation, and also that the United States and the West were piling on and almost taking advantage of Russia in the way some of these negotiations went about the, for one, expansion of NATO, wouldn't you say?
No, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, I think from an American point of view, that was known, that made a certain amount of sense. But, you know, the United States was an uncontested superpower in the 1990s, and I don't think it's felt the need to bend over backwards to sort of privilege or to honor Russian concerns. It didn't make a lot of intuitive sense in the 1990s, and that was interpreted by many Russians, maybe not all, but by many as a kind of arrogance. And so, yes, the seeds are are laid in the 1990s for the conflicts that we see playing out before us. Although I think that there are many ways in which we could have turned or maybe
Yes.
not come to the outcome that we have before our eyes now. But yes, the 1990s are a pivotal decade, and a number of the big problems that we have at the moment can be traced back to those years.
Yeah, nothing is inevitable.
No.
Right? There's always options or side roads to take. About my point just now about all Russians in positions of power and influence. I do this on my podcast. I will take out a book and read a few sentences. This is Mary Elise Sarati's book, Not 1 Inch, about Ukraine and what to do about Ukraine's interest in NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union, but before Ukraine has declared its independence at the end of 1991. If Ukraine decided in that referendum to become fully independent, it would at once commence a painful economic and political divorce from its fellow Slavs and also become a greater nuclear power than either Britain or France. Ukraine's choices would clearly have such far-reaching effects. From Moscow, Ambassador Strauss advised Washington that the most revolutionary event of 1991 for Russia may not be the collapse of communism, but the loss of something Russians of all political stripes think as part of their own body politic and near to the heart at that, Ukraine. Why don't you pick it up from there? I mean, Ukraine has the Baltic states joining NATO may have rankled the Soviet Union, but it's different than Ukraine joining NATO.
Yes, you know, the war colors all of this in the darkest possible terms at the present moment, and that's as it should be, because the war is the most important event of our moment and will be for a long time to come. And the war bespeaks, I think, a high degree of Russian chauvinism and imperialism, really, the sense that you can go into another country and take its territory and
no excuse.
Through coercion and bloodshed determine its future. Behind that it's not a benign history, but it's not necessarily a warlike history, is a kind of sensibility among many Russians that there's a kind of shared civilizational bond between the two countries, that religion in Russia and language and culture and architecture flows from medieval Ukrainian or Kievan history, and that Russian history is built upon that, and that's a matter of sort of harmony and concordance. And in the Soviet period, a lot of people vacationed in Crimea and Ukraine and had sort of positive associations there. The language issue is important, that there are, even today, quite a few Russian speakers in Ukraine, so there's a proximity of language, and that takes us to this notion, very controversial and upsetting, of Putin's, that they are one people. It might sound like it's a friendly notion, but it's a notion upon which he's premised the need for war. But that does resonate at times with attitudes in Russia that see this as yes, exactly as the quote indicates, that Ukraine is a kind of organic part of Russia. It makes Ukraine very different, exactly as you're indicating, from Poland or from the Baltic states or Georgia or other countries.
Sorry to interrupt, but it ignores Ukraine's desires to...
Completely.
You know, history is moving on, right, wrong, or indifferent. The Russians can't get their way anymore in that part of the world if, in fact, Ukraine is to be a sovereign, independent nation, to choose its own path, and it wanted to... Well, maybe I should ask you, what were the attitudes in Ukraine at this point about joining NATO? How strongly were the Ukrainians pushing this idea? At the same time, the West wanted them to safely remove all those nuclear warheads.
Well, I don't think that in the 1990s there was a big push in Ukraine to join NATO. You know, I think that the problems were pretty immediate. People were wrestling with questions of poverty and economic development and state building after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Those, I think, were the most pressing concerns. I don't think there was too much of a worry about a war with Russia or anyone else. I don't think security concerns were paramount in the 1990s. And even according to polling data, even until pretty recently, there wasn't even a majority of Ukrainians who supported the notion of NATO membership. But what you do get over time, the development, I think, a little bit after the 1990s, is a much stronger sense of Ukraine as a part of Europe. And this also speaks to the collapse of borders and walls, that young people start to travel more. Ukraine, of course, has a border with Slovakia and Hungary and Poland and
Western Ukraine historically
has many ties to Austria and to other parts of Europe. So Ukraine starts to see itself as Europe. I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to be zero-sum. It doesn't have to be Europe or Russia. But you start to see that inclination, and that takes us, in a way, to 2013, and to the president of Ukraine then, Viktor Yanukovych, who was about to sign something called an association agreement with the European Union.
EU.
And he was pressured not to do it at the last minute in November of 2013, and that sparks a set of protests that sort of bring us a little bit toward the contemporary moment. But that's not about NATO. That's about Europe.
Right. We forget, with so much focus on NATO, we forget that that was a trade pact with the EU.
Correct.
Putin would not allow it. He tried to offer some loans as compensation because, that trade pact might have cost Russia's economy significantly.
I doubt it. They eventually signed it. I think in 2015 they signed the pact. I don't think it had very serious repercussions. Yes, it was a sort of insult to Russian prestige that Russia was trying to build its own structures, but it was a footnote. It was a detail. It was a huge Russian blunder to make such a mountain out of that, regulatory and institutional molehill.
Yeah, to say the least. 1999. Why does Yeltsin choose Putin?
Well, Yeltsin.
This is one of those key points in history.
It is. Nobody could quite see the significance of it at the time because Putin was unknown outside of Russia. He had been a KGB officer, as I think most of us know, in East Germany. He came back for a while. Apparently, worked as a taxi driver, or said that he worked as a taxi driver, and then got into St. Petersburg local mayoral politics. And then was given the job of head of the FSB, of the intelligence services, in the late 1990s in Moscow. Certainly, he was a very capable manager. Has a PhD in law, has self-discipline and intelligence, so that was attractive to Yeltsin. But there were many people who had those attributes. I think what Yeltsin most importantly felt was that he needed somebody who would come into power and not prosecute his family. Yeltsin had his own issues with corruption, but more to the point, his family members had been on the take. And so if they had ended up in jail, I think Yeltsin would have been, sort of devastated. And so he chose somebody who would be loyal to Yeltsin, as Putin in fact was. Nobody was ever prosecuted from Yeltsin's family. And he got that loyalty. He also got a lot of other things in the bargain. Yes. And you're right, it's a huge turning point.
Scholars do disagree about the extent to which that was the driver behind Yeltsin's decision.
Sure.
About the so-called family. Really, it was organized crime, right, dealing there. But what's funny about that is when you look back at what Yeltsin told Clinton, how he described Putin. He said he's a Democrat, lowercase d.
Right.
He said he's a Democrat. And I recently watched, as I do for so many of my podcasts, I'm digging in the archives, watching old news conferences and events. I watched Vladimir Putin's 2000 you could call it an inaugural address. It was. He did win the election that year. There was an election in Russia. I think he won 53% of the popular vote. So he's in the former Tsarist palace where the Tsars used to sit on the throne. And he's giving an inaugural address. And he's not talking about autocracy or, who would? But he is talking about promoting democracy. He wasn't a thoroughgoing authoritarian, some scholars have said, when he takes over. So what happens?
I think the best way to think of Putin when he begins is not as a Democrat, although he did work for a liberal political figure in St. Petersburg, Sobchak, the mayor of St. Petersburg. I think the way to think of Putin in year 2000 is as a modernizer. That was the promise he sort of made to the Russian people, and for a while it worked.
State builder.
Right, modernizer in the sense that you'll create a system that works, a powerful state, an economy that's comprehensible, and so he did engage in confrontation with various oligarchs. Of course, a lot of the modernization is driven by oil money, so it's not as if Putin did something magical to make the country prosperous. He just sort of benefited from those revenues. But I think he presented himself and was understood by the public as younger, new generation, efficient, competent, not somebody who had a drinking problem like Yeltsin, not somebody who had these personal weaknesses, but it was in the name of modernization. I think democracy would be a bit of a misnomer.
I agree. I'm not trying to make him out to be the next coming of Thomas Jefferson over here. But
no, because you also have the apartment bombings, never explained, but possibly at Putin's instigation, and very, very tough dealings with Chechnya as part of his political promise. So that's there at the beginning.
But he did he did try to restore a sense of state authority after what happened in the 1990s.
Absolutely.
And he also wanted, speaking of resets, we had Clinton, Yeltsin. Then it's interesting how the leadership coincided. George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev kind of leave the scene, kind of at the same time. Clinton, Yeltsin come on together, kind of leave together. George W. Bush and Putin come on together, and George W. Bush certainly sought a reset with Russia. He was very chummy with Putin. We all remember the fishing trip, and that was later in the process. Their very first joint news conference, George W. Bush was at the podium, Putin was standing next to him. He said, "Russia is not the enemy of the United States. The Cold War is over."
Right.
But Putin didn't get what he wanted from Bush, and some historians have argued this is a big reason why he becomes more and more authoritarian and autocratic.
I wouldn't put the U.S. at the center of the story in that way. I think that Putin became autocratic for internal reasons. It speaks to his personality, his sense of power, the vision that he has for Russia. Eventually, he latches onto a very, sort of conservative in the sense of reactionary, autocratic vision
ultra-nationalist.
Yes, of Russia's past and of Russia's future. And I don't think that that's a function of anything George W. Bush did or anything that the U.S. did, although the U.S. is always the foil to Putin's Russia. I think more to the point when it comes to where those two figures diverged was the Iraq War. So Putin warned against it. He thought it was a bad idea. He may have been onto something with that. He felt like he wasn't listened to. He felt like the U.S. was becoming disruptive and going down the wrong path. And I think that really crushes the relationship between George W. Bush and Putin. But I wouldn't use that to explain Putin's autocratic turn. I think that comes from within.
I think that's a good point. And it wasn't just Putin who tried to talk Bush out of invading Iraq.
For sure.
Jacques Chirac and others.
Joschka Fischer and many others, yeah.
Yeah, and because the U.S. did what it wanted, the Russians did take from that when we're going to do what we wanted, what we want as well.
No,
doesn't excuse it. Right?
Crucial to the Russian narrative that the U.S. broke the rules, so who was the U.S. to impose the rules?
And over time, Putin, maybe he's always been this way, he's taken on, in terms of foreign policy and Ukraine's place in all of this, because we are here to discuss how we got to this war in Ukraine, an ultra-nationalist, often fantastical version of history about Ukraine. But this whole time, Ukraine's place in the new Europe is never fully resolved.
True.
It remains an irritant to Russia, and I think pouring gasoline on that fire, George W. Bush at the Bucharest conference in 2008. Well, first in 2007, Putin's at the Munich Security Conference, and he lays down a line.
Right.
Georgia and Ukraine are not going to join NATO. 2008, George W. Bush goes up to after the Bucharest conference, which was a NATO meeting, and says, "We want Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO." That seems like a really important turning point here.
That's very true. I think that if you take a step back, what's really at issue is not the expansion of NATO, especially the expansion of NATO as it was up until 2004 into the Baltic republics, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary. I mean, it's true that the Russians didn't like it, but they lived with it, and it was not the end of the world.
There's not much they could do to stop it.
No,
they needed money.
Not much they could do, and not much that they did do to stop it. So that's not the crux of the matter. And I think even those issues with the Bucharest summit, unfortunate wording. I think most people would agree that it's regrettable that W. Bush put it in those terms. But I think it's not even that. That's the heart of the story. I think the heart of the story is that for the West, and for the U.S. in particular, as the most important country in all of this, they could never really decide where Ukraine fit. And it's dangerous in some respects to leave a country half in, half out.
Worst of both worlds.
Right. So there was enough there in the U.S. posture to provoke Russia up to a point.
And the U.S. never withdrew that offer, even though I think at some point everyone kind of understood Ukraine was not going to join.
It's still in effect, but it's of course just a statement. So the U.S. did enough to anger Russia when it came to its Ukraine policy, but it didn't do enough to protect Ukraine. So it should have made a more coherent choice in 2008. Maybe it wasn't even about NATO membership. I think that was always difficult because NATO requires, as we know now from Turkey, which is causing some problems with Sweden and Finland, NATO, to enter, for a new country to enter, you have to have a unanimous
all 30.
Vote, and that may have been difficult for Ukraine, but you could have built up a more robust security relationship starting in 2008 and just made it a matter of security assistance and military cooperation. So that could have been another solution in the past. But when you look back in retrospect, we have to be critical of this, neither this nor that policy.
Well, the idea also was that no country gets a veto, right, over, Russia does not deserve a veto.
For sure.
But you also have to, look at things, the world as it is, instead of the world that you want. And I understand that U.S. policymakers at the 2008 Bucharest conference maybe weren't thinking that way. They basically said, sorry, this is going to happen. But I mean, this was an irritant, but I'll give you a different point of view about that from Stephen Kotkin,
Sure.
the great scholar. I know that you're an admirer of his.
Great admirer.
Before I talk about Kotkin, have you read his Stalin volumes?
Yes, of course.
Yes. They take a long time to get through, but they're brilliant books. Volume 1 and Volume 2, and I can't wait for Volume 3. Probably going to be about 1,500 pages. Well, he's got to get the whole World War II and the early Cold War.
Right.
Okay. Not to digress. Okay, so Stephen Kotkin gave an interview, I have to cite my sources here, gave an interview to the New Yorker. Mm-hmm. He was asked about John Mearsheimer, I referenced him earlier, his argument that the U.S. is responsible for the war by pushing NATO on Ukraine. George Kennan, the great George Kennan, has made the same argument, or close to the same argument. Kotkin says, I respectfully disagree. The problem with their argument is that it assumes that had NATO not expanded, Russia wouldn't be the same or very likely close to what it is today. Kotkin says what we have today in Russia is not some kind of surprise. It's not some kind of deviation from a historical pattern. Way before NATO existed in the 19th century, Russia looked like this. It had an autocrat. It had repression. It had militarism. It had suspicion of foreigners and the West. This is a Russia that we know, said Kotkin. It's not a Russia that arrived yesterday or in the 1990s. It's not a response to the actions of the West. There are internal processes in Russia that account for where we are today. It sounds like you agree with that based on what you've been saying.
Yes, I think it's a very fair point. I mean, George Kennan in 1997, in an interview with Tom Friedman, said that the expansion of NATO was going to lead in a negative direction. I don't think he could have foreseen the war of 2022. Of course, we can go back and talk about 2014 and 2015.
I do. Next, we'll get to that.
I think it's, and this is to be a little bit more pointed than the great Steve Kotkin in terms of that analysis. To blame NATO expansion for the Russian invasion of February 2022 is really ludicrous. The nature of the invasion, the motivations, at best, joining NATO is a very distant prospect in 2022. If it was even a real prospect before the war, maybe it will become a prospect because of the war. But before the war, it wasn't a real prospect. So to put NATO in any causal sense at the beginning of that story is just off the mark.
NATO expansion may or may not have been a good idea, but you're arguing it cannot be blamed for that. I
Correct.
mean, there is an argument to be made for that based on Putin himself, his view of history. And as Mr. Kotkin explained and others have explained, it goes back to this kind of ultra-nationalist. He doesn't want to bring back the Soviet Union. He wants to bring back Greater Russia. And sometimes aging autocrats can become unhinged or unmoored from reality. I don't think Putin's insane, and we got to be careful about trying to psychoanalyze somebody. But we know that he's changed a lot recently. He's isolated. He sits at that 20-foot. Can you imagine doing this podcast with me 20 feet away from me? I'd be
Right.
shouting. He meets everybody like that. He who knows if he's getting good advice. So I don't know if you have anything to offer there before we talk about your experience in the State Department and Ukraine, but any final points about Putin and his worldview at this time in his life?
Well, it's one of the big debates with Putin. I think that historians will be debating this for a long time to come. What has changed? And maybe not that much. Maybe he's just shown his true colors in the last couple of months. And what we saw before was a sort of hidden or moderate version of Putin. I'm a little bit more inclined to say that Putin himself seems to have changed. And one way that seems really significant to me is that he's much more of a risk taker at the moment than I thought he was before. Obviously, Putin could be aggressive.
Yes. He was a shrewd operator.
If you have any questions about Putin's willingness to use brutal tactics on civilians, you need only go back to the Syrian war of 2015 or to the wars in Chechnya, where much of what's happening in Ukraine was anticipated by the actions of the Russian military. So that's not a boundary that he's crossed recently. He crossed that boundary long ago. But the kind of risk that he's taken with his own economy on the battlefields of Ukraine, I mean, it's a war he could lose. And that's an enormous risk for Russia to take, because if they lose the war, Putin himself will not survive politically. So he's gambled everything on this, and I never thought he was quite the gambler that he seems to be.
Well, it raises a whole host of issues about the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons, how long the war might last, how far he's willing to go to save face. And where are the diplomats? Almost all wars end in a negotiated settlement. Total victory is a myth. We think of World War II. That was an anomaly. The conquest of the Axis powers, the occupations of their countries. We wrote their new constitutions for them in the case of Japan. I don't think we're going to see total victory in Ukraine, but only fools try to predict the future. One last point about Putin, as you were saying, was he always like this or has he changed? In the West, he was underestimated, I think. I think Obama underestimated him. Trump's relationship with Putin has been the subject of a lot of debate. Anthony Beaver, the great military historian, believes that the West, however defined, did underestimate him, despite the fact that there were wars in Chechnya, a war in Georgia, the annexation of Crimea, that he really is kind of this type of, well, if not a gangster simply interested in accumulating his own wealth, an ultra-nationalist who felt humiliated by the collapse of the Soviet Union.
I think there was often a sense in the U.S. and in the West of Putin as sort of a loser.
Yeah,
There's that phrase that Obama had. He's like
that.
the kid who kind of slouches in the back of the classroom and, sort of aloof and surly and all of that.
Basically said, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Obama basically said, Russia is just a regional power.
Right.
He may have been right about that, but the Russians don't want to hear that.
Well, and what does that even mean to say a country's a regional power? As everybody knows, Russia has nuclear weapons, and I think it's to confuse
A lot.
It's to confuse two things. To say, is the country capable of a very effective modernization? And obviously, Putin's Russia is not. He came in as a modernizer, but he didn't succeed in modernizing the country. China has gone way beyond Russia in terms of its economy, and China will be one of the dominant countries of the 21st century. I doubt that Russia will be for the long haul, but you can be a country that doesn't modernize, and you can still create enormous problems, not just for your neighbors, but for the whole international system, which is what Putin has done in the last couple of months. So his capacity to do harm should never have been underestimated.
Yes.
His, aloofness or, in some ways mediocrity as a leader, I think that there's a degree of truth to that, but that may be beside the point because he can wreak havoc.
And he's proving that. Russia is also just too big and too important a country with too many natural resources.
For sure.
As we speak here today, I read a headline how Finland is going to start cutting off gas imports. I mean, the West is putting the pressure sanctions-wise on Russia. At some point, there has to be a renewal of some type of functioning relationship. That's my editorializing. I want to ask you one or two, to wrap up, a couple of questions about your experience as a member of the State Department. You were already a professional scholar and expert on U.S. Russia relations. You worked for the State Department in 2014 to 2016. You became a member, as I said, of the Policy Planning Department. Your portfolio was Russia and Ukraine. This is a key moment. Today Ukrainians, even those who may have been sympathetic to Russia, today Ukrainians are united
Sure.
Against Russian domination. But in 2014, even after the annexation, we still had parts of Ukraine that were still maybe tilting more towards the east.
Sure.
How would you characterize Ukrainians' feelings at that important moment after the annexation, with a large part of the country wanting to pull away from Russia and join the West, so to speak?
It was certainly more complicated than what you describe at the present moment. It's a large country.
War clarifies things.
Right. It's a large country regionally and has its own regional differences. And there were parts of the country that inclined more economically and culturally toward Russia and more toward the West. I think more importantly than that, though, I mean, that's true for many countries that they have different, the United States has different regional affiliations. But more important than that, I think there wasn't a strong belief in government. That's what the revolution was about in 2014, was creating a new kind of government. And that was only a partial success up until, well, maybe even until the present moment. It hasn't fully succeeded, that project of reform, but in a way that I could not
weeding out corruption.
Right. In a way that I could not have anticipated when I was at the State Department. There was one great success of American policy in those years, but it was very subtle, and it took a long time to play out. And this was whatever contribution the United States made to democracy in Ukraine, however we would define this. Because in 2019, you have an election in Ukraine, and Petro Poroshenko, the sort of oligarch president who had been there since 2014.
Not a Democrat, really.
Well,
maybe.
A man with his flaws, but, he operated within the democratic system,
Okay.
I'd say. He's voted out of office, and you get this younger figure who's the first post-Soviet leader of an East Slavic state, of Belarus, Russia, or Ukraine. He's the first one to be of a younger generation, a different mentality, a different connection to his people. He's not the world's greatest president between 2019 and 2022. I mean, his popularity rating was very low when the war began. But lo and behold, you get a war, and this is somebody who can deal with his own population. So I think that election in 2019 was absolutely pivotal, and whatever the U.S. did to help create the conditions of that, and it did do something, that was an extraordinary investment in Ukraine's future. Had Poroshenko or somebody like that, a kind of oligarch, been in power when the war began, I think some of that Ukrainian skepticism about the state might have been stronger, and the war might have been more difficult to prosecute. So there, I'm happy to speak about the things that we did wrong or to speak critically. I think there was one really kind of remarkable area of success that was only visible over the long term.
That's an amazing point. Yeah, I tend to focus on what goes wrong. That's my
Right.
job as a reporter, I suppose.
Well,
and thank you for correcting my comment about the predecessor to Zelensky. So, final question. I mean it this time. By the way, I've noticed you haven't been drinking your water. If only you knew this wasn't water. That's a joke. It's not happy hour yet. No, final question. I'm concerned about this war and its ripples. We're going to be feeling the ripple effects for potentially decades. You know, we tend to, in this country, enjoy when I say we, who am I talking about? The political elites in this country, the Biden administration is very proud of the unification of NATO, the sense of purpose, the raison d'etre again. But on the ground in Eastern Europe, we're seeing a catastrophe unfold. And we know that wars, they don't end. They migrate to other places. They migrate to our minds. They migrate to legacies of rancor and ethnic hatred. Maybe there won't be ethnic hatred in this case as there was in early 20th century Europe. But what are your final thoughts on what could happen from this point on?
So let me make 2 points by way of conclusion in terms of your very important question. I think that what the Biden administration must do is to explain to the American people how important regional European stability is. The United States fought 2 wars in the 20th century because stability got out of hand in Europe. Those were different wars, different situations. It's not equivalent, but we really, as a country, need to be invested in regional stability, European stability. I don't have the perfect recipe for how we achieve stability in terms of the current war, but
it's okay. It's not your job to know.
It's very, very important, and I think Biden needs to communicate that. He's got the think tanks of DC on his side. He needs to communicate that to the general public, or else we're going to be in real trouble with the policy. And that takes me to the second point, which is that the war is going to, exactly as you suggest, have some very long-term costs for the people of Ukraine. Undoubtedly, first and foremost, for the people of Ukraine. We spoke earlier about refugees and displaced people and the death of civilians, which is heartbreaking. And ongoing, of course, have higher wheat and commodity prices that are becoming important as a result of the war. That could result in hunger and starvation by the end of this calendar year. And of course, inflation, because of ruptures to the global economy and higher commodity prices, oil prices, gas prices, etc., is going to be an issue that already affects us, but it's going to affect us more because of the war. So there's not probably that much that Washington can do about those big global problems, apart from try to manage them effectively. I don't think we can get rid of them because we can't get rid of the war overnight. But for people to be aware that that's on the horizon, and at the same time to see what the core U.S. interests are in the situation, and that the U.S. has to stay engaged and has to stay sort of on target with this, and if we can sort of keep these 2 points in some kind of harmony, we'll be okay.
Well, I promise we'd be wrapping up. I just one final comment. I mean, the United States has become the de facto guarantor of Ukraine's independence.
To be sure.
It's costing tens of billions of taxpayer dollars when we have our own problems to deal with here, without any debate in Congress. No real debate.
Sure.
I'm not saying stop supporting Ukraine. I'm not saying support Ukraine for as long as the war lasts. Whatever the right policy is, there's no debate in our country. And this leads to mission creep. We've been down this. We've seen this movie before. I don't ever think you're going to see U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine. But the longer the war lasts, the worse the potential outcomes, at least in my view.
Well, I don't have a good counter to that. I think that the Biden administration sees a chance for a significant degree of military accomplishment, if not victory, over the summer. That may be proven true, it may be proven false, but I think that's one reason why there's such a rapid investment at the present moment. But I agree, over time you have to set priorities, at times you have to set limits.
Where's Congress?
And,
where's the diplomats?
Sort of come to a sense of what a desirable end state would be. I don't think we're there yet, but it's also heartening to me to see this degree of support for Ukraine at the present moment, given the stakes of what's happening on the battlefield. But down the road, those priorities and limits have to be very clearly articulated for the policies to succeed.
Yeah, how does this end? To pull a Vietnam era question back to how does it end? The weakening of Russia. That's kind of a fuzzy goal, but I understand it's easy for me to just sit here and fire the questions away at you and at the leaders of our country. So it's much more difficult to answer the questions. We want to thank Michael Kimmage, historian, Catholic University, for stopping by at History as It Happens. And I hope you all enjoyed this interesting discussion about what's going on today. Remember, everything happening today comes from somewhere, and that is the goal, the aim of History as It Happens from the Washington Times.